It was a quiet evening, the kind that crept in slowly, slipping over the house like a shadow, filling every corner with a strange, weighty silence. Outside, the last slivers of sunlight faded behind the hills, casting a burnt orange glow that seemed to cling to the sky, as if unwilling to let go. I was in the kitchen, my hands moving mechanically as I stirred a simmering pot on the stove. The hum of the old radio was the only sound, a soft murmur that seemed distant, almost drowned by the quiet tension lurking around me. My son, Ethan, had just returned home for the weekend, a break from college, from his world, from the life he was building away from me. But as much as I wanted to feel relieved, grateful even, there was an unsettling weight in the air, something I couldn't shake off, no matter how hard I tried. The boy I'd raised had grown up into a stranger, yet one who knew me better than anyone else. At 21, he was tall, confident, sharp-eyed, and had this edge to him that felt both familiar and completely alien. "Dinner's ready," I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast silence of the house. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his frame filling the room as he leaned casually against the doorframe, arms crossed, studying me with an intensity that stopped me cold. I forced a smile, gesturing to the table, trying to brush off the uneasy feeling tightening in my chest. We sat across from each other, the table between us suddenly feeling like an inadequate barrier. He told me about his classes, his friends, even the professors he couldn't stand. But his voice, steady and deliberate, held an undercurrent I hadn't heard before. He was looking at me differently tonight, with a sort of focus that felt too heavy, too deliberate. His gaze lingered, his words carefully chosen, each one rolling out slowly, as if he was building up to something he hadn't yet dared to say. "So, college life," I tried to keep it light, forcing myself to meet his eyes, though the intensity there made my skin prickle. He nodded, eyes still fixed on me. "Yeah, it's fine." His lips curled slightly, a shadow of a smirk, but there was no humor in it. "But Mum," he leaned in, resting his arms on the table, his gaze not breaking, his voice lowering to almost a whisper. "There's something I've been meaning to talk to you about." The words hung in the air, dense, pressing. My throat tightened as I swallowed, trying to push down the unsettling twist in my stomach. His tone, it was too intense, too serious, and in the back of my mind I could feel an instinctual alarm going off, warning me, telling me to look away, to break the spell. But I couldn't. My gaze was locked on his, trapped in whatever it was he was building up to. "Go on," I managed, my voice barely a whisper, hands clenching under the table. Ethan leaned back, his expression softening, but his eyes still held that unyielding focus. I think about how things used to be, back when it was just us. And sometimes I miss it." His voice was soft, layered with something almost vulnerable. "I miss the way things felt. Simple, comfortable." A chill traced its way down my spine. I knew what he meant. I'd felt it too. That echo of what once was, of a time when our lives were intertwined, undivided by distance, by years, by the changes life had forced on us. But the way he said it, the longing in his tone, held a depth that felt wrong. "I miss it too, Ethan," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "But life changes. You're building your own path now. It's natural." He looked at me, his gaze softening, but the intensity remained, flickering beneath the surface like a barely contained flame. "Doesn't mean I don't still need you, though," he replied, his voice low, the words lingering in the space between us. There was something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. It was a look that lingered too long, a gaze that went beyond the surface, piercing through me in a way that made my heart pound uncomfortably. I swallowed, trying to push down the strange feeling knotting in my stomach. "I'll always be here for you." "Ethan," I managed, my voice sounding thin in the silence. But even as I said it, there was a nagging doubt clawing at me, a doubt I couldn't ignore, even as I tried to hold on to the normalcy, to keep the conversation from slipping into something I couldn't control. Ethan's gaze didn't waver, his eyes fixed on mine in a way that felt both comforting and unnervingly intense. I reached for my water glass, feeling my hand tremble just enough for him to notice. "Are you okay, Mum?" His voice was low, soft, but there was something more behind it, an edge that made my heart skip a beat. "Of course," I replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired. Long week, you know." He didn't buy it. His eyes held a quiet scrutiny, studying me as if he could see past every wall I'd built, every shield I'd tried to put up. I'd always prided myself on being strong, on not letting anyone see the cracks. But here, with Ethan sitting across from me, that strength felt like paper-thin armor, barely holding together. Dinner continued in a forced silence, each clink of silverware against the plates sounding louder, sharper. When we finally finished, I stood, gathering the dishes, desperate for an excuse to move, to break free from his gaze. But Ethan stood up too, reaching out to take the plates from my hands. "I got it," he said softly, his fingers grazing mine. The touch lingered, sending a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. I pulled my hand back, looking away, hoping he hadn't noticed the way my breath caught. "Thanks, Ethan," I muttered, turning to walk toward the living room. hoping the dim light and quiet comfort of the space would calm my racing heart. He followed me, moving to sit on the couch beside me. The silence settled around us, heavy and thick, wrapping us in a strange tension that neither of us seemed willing to break. We put on a movie, some old favorite we'd watched countless times before, but my focus was elsewhere, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control, couldn't stop. I kept catching glimpses of him from the corner of my eye, noticing the subtle shifts in his expression, the way he seemed so grown, so different from the boy I'd once known. And then, just as I was about to sink into the familiar comfort of the movie, Ethan shifted closer. His knee brushed against mine, and I felt a flash of something electric, something unsettling, that sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to ignore it, to brush it off as nothing, but my heart pounded against my chest, refusing to settle. "Mum," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. I turned to look at him, forcing a calm expression, even as my pulse raced. Yes. He hesitated, his gaze locking onto mine, intense and unwavering. I don't know how to say this. His hand reached out almost instinctively, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was gentle, light, but it felt like it held 1,000 unspoken words, 1,000 hidden meanings that neither of us dared to voice. I pulled my hand away, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow, even to my own ears. "You're being mysterious, Ethan. Just spit it out." I tried to keep it light, tried to brush off the strange heaviness of the moment, but his eyes were serious, and there was a look there, something I'd never seen before. He took a breath, glancing down, almost as if he was weighing his words carefully. I don't know, Mum. Being away at college, it's like everything changed. I feel like I'm losing something." His voice trailed off, his gaze drifting, as if he was searching for words he couldn't quite find. Like what I pressed gently, my voice barely above a whisper, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Like us, his words were soft, filled with a vulnerability that struck me, a raw honesty that caught me off guard. "I miss us. I miss how close we were." My heart pounded, his words sinking in with a weight that felt too heavy to bear. I'd felt it too, that distance, that slow drift that had happened without either of us even noticing. But hearing him say it out loud, seeing the longing in his eyes, the ache there, was different. It was real. I miss it too," Ethan, I said softly, barely managing to hold his gaze. But even as I said it, I could feel the line between us beginning to blur, a line that I wasn't sure either of us should cross. Ethan's eyes softened as I spoke, his expression shifting into something deeper, something that made the room feel smaller, like we were the only two people left in the world. I took a breath, forcing myself to hold his gaze, but his stare was unrelenting, steady in a way that made my pulse quicken. "Sometimes I wonder," he began, his voice low, thoughtful, "if things would be different if I hadn't left." The words felt loaded, weighted down with a meaning he didn't put into words, but was somehow unmistakable. I felt myself tensing, a mix of confusion, and something I didn't want to name stirring inside me. "Ethan, going to college was the right decision," I said, my tone firmer than I'd intended. "You're building a life for yourself. That's important." I tried to keep my voice steady, to hold on to the role of the mother, the protector. But even as I spoke, I could feel the words wavering. He just nodded, his eyes flickering down to his hands, a shadow of frustration passing across his face. I know it was the right thing to do. But he trailed off, his voice heavy with something unspoken. He looked up again, his gaze capturing mine. "It doesn't make it any easier." His words hit me harder than I expected, a subtle confession hiding behind each syllable. I swallowed, trying to gather my thoughts, to shake off the uneasy feeling wrapping around me like a fog. This wasn't how I'd expected the evening to go. I wanted simplicity, peace, the comfort of familiarity. Instead, I was sinking into an emotional quagmire I hadn't prepared for. I felt his hand reach out, his fingers brushing against mine, lingering just long enough to make my heart pound. I knew I should pull back, create space, re-establish the boundaries that had somehow started to erode over the years. But I stayed frozen, unable to move, trapped in the silent current pulling us together. "Mum," he said softly, his voice barely more than a murmur, "do you ever wonder about the choices we made?" His question hung in the air, thick and heavy, drawing me into a place I hadn't allowed myself to venture. Choices. We'd both made so many. Some I'd questioned, some I'd regretted. But now, sitting here, under his intense, searching gaze, I felt as if every choice, every memory, every decision was somehow coming to life, haunting the space between us. "I try not to look back too much," Ethan, I replied carefully, forcing a small smile though it felt hollow. "We can't change the past, and what's done is done." But sometimes, he continued, undeterred, his voice holding an edge I couldn't quite read, "I just think, what if things had been different?" I looked at him, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and apprehension welling up inside. It was as if he was reaching for something that should remain buried, And yet, I felt myself leaning into his words, into the dangerous comfort they offered. Different. How I whispered, not sure I wanted to hear the answer, yet somehow unable to stop myself from asking. He hesitated, his gaze flickering with uncertainty, as if he too was navigating unfamiliar ground. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft, laced with something raw, just different, like maybe if we hadn't drifted so far apart. For a moment, everything was still. Ethan's words hung between us, heavy with a meaning I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Part of me wanted to retreat, to maintain the line between us, while another part could feel just how blurred those lines had become. I looked down, trying to hide the emotions that had risen in my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ethan," I said, my voice wavering slightly, "I'm your mother. I'll always be here for you, but what?" The warning in my own mind echoed this night. This feeling was something powerful enough to mislead us both. I turned to him, meeting his gaze, knowing what I was about to say might hurt. I know you're my mother," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper, yet filled with intensity. "But sometimes I don't know how to control what I feel. The distance, it's been hard." We were standing in the same room, in the same silence, both feeling the weight of emotions too tangled to make sense of. Looking at him, lost in my own thoughts, I knew I had to rid my heart of these confusing feelings. Rebuilding the safe bond we'd once shared was necessary, no matter how hard it felt. Taking a steadying breath, I leaned forward, my voice finding strength. "Ethan, you can always love me," I said, my tone firmer now. "But that doesn't mean we're meant to cross these lines. What we have will always be as mother and son." My words were a final point, a boundary that perhaps we both needed to set to find emotional peace. Ethan stayed silent, his face reflecting a mixture of acceptance and sadness, the fire in his gaze softening into something quieter, something understanding. He nodded, finally, a sign of letting go. "You're right," he murmured. "This is the way it should be." That night, we both let the complicated feelings slip into something simpler, a sense of acceptance and peace. The next morning, he packed his bags and prepared to return to his life. As he left, the house settled into silence, filling me with a sense of relief and calm. We both knew what was right. And just like that, what had once been confusing gave way to a renewed, steady bond, one defined by knowing who we were to each other, and nothing more.